Welcome to ThinkData, helping third sector organisations to make better use of data. Find out more at www.thinkdata.org.uk.
So this is a webinar talk for the Scottish Civil Society Data Partnership project for the webinar of the 3rd of March 2016. This is given by Paul Lambert and the talk is on secondary survey data. Some of you following the webinar might in fact be aware that the same project, the Civil Society Data Partnership project, we've already had a more extended workshop on the same topic of secondary survey data and its possible uses in research on civil society. That took place on the 25th of February. And we've got quite a lot of materials from that session that are available online, and you're encouraged to and welcome to pick up at any point that's convenient. We've got some slides and discussions, again reflecting on secondary survey data, just as I'm doing here actually. We've got a lab session with a workbook and associated guidance materials and downloadable files. And we've got some additional presentational materials, discussions on particular aspects of working in secondary survey data analysis. If you do go and have a look at the ThinkData website, under events you'll find the link to training workshops, CSDP training workshops. There's workshop 1 that we're talking about here. The title was Using Secondary Survey Data to Explore Civil Society, and various things available for you to download at your leisure. So, brief talk today on secondary survey data, what it is and why it's important or potentially important for people interested in civil society. In this case, in this context, in contemporary Scotland. Secondary survey data, or research based on secondary survey data, is in an interesting position in the contemporary UK, in that it's quite exciting in that there's more and more high quality resources of a very good standard and capacity for doing research. At the same time, it's been around for quite some time. We've had secondary survey data resources archived and available for further research use from the 1960s actually. So for some people it's a story that's already been told, but for many it's a very rich research resource that is actually often somewhat underused in contemporary research. By secondary survey data, and really I'm talking about secondary social survey data resources, we're talking about deliberately collected research data that's then made available for other people to pick up the data files for and do some analysis on. This research data, it's usually beginning from a requirement to undertake a survey for a government sponsor or a comparably large-scale agency. Most of the secondary survey data that's used by academic researchers, for example, will typically either be a major government survey or a survey that's actually undertaken and collected by a higher education institute, but itself is funded originally by government money. Secondary survey data really is a powerful research resource for a number of quality reasons. It's usually providing us with access to information which is of a much larger scale and wider scope than we could reasonably get our hands on by any other means. typically secondary survey data sets might cover tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individual survey interviews, for example, whether it's with people or whatever the subjects are. And it's also collected with the best quality resources in most instances, so well-trained, experienced interviewers typically conducting face-to-face interviews, high-quality sampling design teams working on the surveys, coming up with a sampling strategy, producing good quality data resources. I've put in my note here, data curation and documentation of these large-scale surveys is another high-quality feature of these resources, and what that refers to is the way in which information about the survey is preserved and made available for other people, the curation and organisation of the data. There's long established practice for doing this in a useful, effective way. And so if you are, as a researcher, picking up a large-scale secondary survey data set, you'll generally expect to get really quite well documented and well organised data as well. Another attractive feature of a lot of the secondary survey data is that they're often quite impressive, ambitious, complex designs to the survey itself. So lots of the secondary surveys are more than just a one-off cross-sectional snapshot of society. They may well be longitudinal, going back to the same people on more than one occasion and asking them comparable questions. They may have particular features designed to aid comparability over time or between place. They'll often have more ambitious or more exciting elements to their design. So alongside the good news that secondary survey data is of a very high standard, it's also an obvious point that it's a sensible way to proceed if you don't have so much by way of research resources. You want a high quality data resource for not much money. So the majority of publicly funded secondary survey data sets that are archived at something like the UK Data Archive are available free for non-profit research, or at a minimal cost, just an administrative charge sometimes. So it's a very efficient model of doing research. It's also scientifically appealing because if other people can access the same data resource, then you've got a transparency of research sources and perhaps replicability, the repeatability of research by other people. Also, another efficiency to the data is you effectively bypass complex ethical problems of accessing data, because this is usually dealt with at the original archiving stage, the depositing of the data at the first instance. And arguably, although not everyone experiences this the first time round, but arguably it's not so hard ultimately to do analysis with secondary survey data sets. There are certainly some rather specialist skills and abilities needed to do things with secondary data, but after a little bit of training or use of online guidance and resources, these are doable. These are something that most people in the social sciences are capable of undertaking. And these attractions and strengths of secondary survey data, they've been obvious for quite some time. There's writing on reflecting on the qualities of secondary survey data going back over several decades. The UK Data Archive, which is the primary hub for the depositing and distribution of data resources, was actually founded in the mid-1960s, and for quite a while we've recognised that there's a lot of useful information out there in the form of secondary survey data sets. An interesting contextual question in relation to today's short webinar is whether or not secondary survey data should be thought of as big data. There are different perspectives on this, and it kind of depends what you yourself think big data is, because people are by no means agreed. Certainly secondary survey data has many of the characteristics of big data. Certainly the scale of records, complexity, comprehensiveness of information across a range of different aspects of lives, and also the growth in the scale and content of secondary survey data over relatively recent time periods. We've seen a considerable expansion in secondary resources. All of these are very much in line with models associated with the big data characterization. Certainly, in my opinion, speaking as delivering this talk, I would certainly class secondary survey data. Excuse me, I wonder if I'm going to get through this recording with a cough. I would certainly class secondary survey data as a version of big data in that sense, but it is a resource that's deliberately collected for research purposes, and for some people big data wouldn't have that characteristic. Big data would be a byproduct, something collected for some other reason, but that can then be used for research. And also big data, of course, is generally associated with new innovations and developments in data resources. And of course secondary survey data is lots of things, but it's not new. We've had it and been aware of its properties for quite some time. So depending on your framework, the answer is yes or no on whether or not secondary survey data should be thought of as big data. A few more reflections on secondary survey data resources. There is lots to get excited about if you're that way inclined to the developments and features of secondary survey data resources as research facilities. Basically, in the last decade or two, they've expanded steadily in their scale and scope and complexity, and also the quality of the data being recorded. And I'm trying to summarize that in a few points here. So that opens the doors in turn, for example, to a wider range of statistical analysis options applied to these data resources. Certainly when you look at the research that's being done with some of the largest and most impressive secondary data sources and the statistical methods being used, they're quite ambitious and complex, and they're quite different to what was being done not that long ago, a decade or two ago, in terms of statistical analysis methods and techniques. Often these days secondary survey data resources are actually linked and connected to other supplementary data, such as administrative data. It might be something from health records or even tax records or some way, obviously with careful attention to ethical issues and possibilities for accessing data. Sometimes even additional descriptive qualitative data is collected within large-scale surveys, so people might be asked to write out free text responses, write a paragraph of reflection on something, and that data can be processed and stored and made available, and often in an interesting way. And an impressive feature of the accumulation of data resources is just the steady expansion over time in how much data researchers are able to get through this mode, through downloading in some way secondary survey data resources. An amazing example of this, I would say, is IPUMS, the International Public Use Microdata Series, which is funded by the US government. IPUMS refers to a number of different data collection and distribution projects, most of which are based on census data, but sometimes also other social survey data. IPUMS International collects data from many different countries. Data from 560 million people and 258 censuses across the world, from about 70 different countries, if I remember correctly. IPUMS USA is census and socioeconomic data from the United States. North Atlantic Population Project, linked to IPUMS, is historical census data from the 19th century from a number of countries. All of this data, you can go to these websites and download extracts from the data in a very efficient and well-organized manner quite quickly. So you've got very powerful data resources to hand in one form or another. In my slide I've put a brief note about one of the big UK secondary survey data resources, something called Understanding Society, or the UK HLS, UK Household Longitudinal Study. This is one of the biggest and most impressive of the contemporary large-scale social surveys that's available for secondary use at the current time. It's a very large sample with a panel element, which basically means re-interviewing the same people each year. The bulk of the people in the survey were first interviewed in 2009, but some of them were interviewed much earlier, actually in 1991, and have been interviewed annually since then. And the UK HLS is a well-organised, reasonably easy to use survey, with some complex features, but readily downloaded and readily worked with information across a very broad spectrum of aspects of its respondents' lives, so socioeconomic issues, employment and so forth, leisure, lifestyle, behaviour, attitudes and values, health, and biosocial features of people, things like their height and weight and other data about them. Amazingly rich information about the subjects of this survey makes it a very powerful resource in many respects, and it does have quite a bit of data about leisure activities, including things like volunteering, as well as employment activities in the sector of employment. There's many interesting research possibilities with this surveys. It's worth reflecting. I keep saying how great secondary survey data is for research purposes. It's worth perhaps admitting that not everyone is enamoured with these data resources, and it's only perhaps a smallish proportion of social science research users that are working with these sorts of data resources. One limitation of some forms of secondary survey data work is that you can, of course, be a little bit constrained by the questions that were asked in the survey. You can't change things subsequently. Sometimes the measures and the structures that you would want to work with aren't quite there. You've got to use something a little bit suboptimal. I've put this image of data on volunteering from one of the big UK secondary surveys, the British Household Panel Survey. The quality of the information about volunteering in that survey is probably a little bit suboptimal. It's probably not the best way of finding out what people are doing. The proportions here are quite low, and actually lower than they might be from other sources, for instance. So you're a little bit constrained in the data resources. Sometimes as well it takes quite some time before the secondary survey data is available for reuse. It might be several years after the data is collected before you can get to it. Two more perhaps important points or interesting points about why people don't use secondary survey data. One is a more organisational thing about how social science is done. The same people who are potentially users of secondary survey data resources are also potentially users of other forms of big data resource, and some people believe that the days of secondary survey data are numbered, in that other forms of big data, byproduct data, should naturally replace these large-scale, high-quality designed survey structures. And that's open to debate. I don't agree with that framework, but some people do. But one of the consequences is some people are diverted from working with these secondary survey resources to work on other forms of large-scale data resources, big data structures, which does have the effect of less use of secondary survey data than you might expect. But I would say the most important reason why quite a few people are not using secondary survey data, even though it might be quite useful for their research purposes, is that it is a little bit challenging in different ways. It's large and complicated, and does require a certain number of technical skills that don't look easy. And you're working with a data resource that you didn't collect yourself. You don't have a personal investment in it. It's a bit technical and abstract. I would certainly maintain that it's quite possible to become comfortable and efficient and effective in working with secondary survey data resources, developing relevant technical skills. But these are slightly challenging things to do in the first instance, so it's not surprising that a fair number of people perhaps turn away from these types of data resources when they might be productive for them. If you were thinking about actually getting hold of secondary survey data, the conventional model is to download information, electronic file of secondary survey data to your own local machine and analyze it on your machine. And if you're interested in doing that, you can go to, in the UK, the obvious place would be the UK Data Service, which is one of the major providers of these resources. It's not the only one, but it's perhaps the most important. And you'd be able to search across the data resources that they have at the UK Data Archive, and when relevant, find suitable resources and download them to your machine. This is of course a little bit challenging and does involve a few steps of research, which I try to summarize in these slides. Basically, you're saving a copy of the original data somewhere on your local machine, and because of the scale of the original data, you're nearly always using a software package to then open up the data and do some analysis on it. So secondary survey data is hard to do without a software package that's designed for this sort of task. We'll say some more in later webinar activities actually about qualities and features of different sorts of software and tools for analysis. But most people working in this way are opening files that are saved locally through software. And just as a little point of information, because secondary survey data resources are rather complicated things, when we use the software, it's generally important to have a good quality record of what we're doing with the software. And usually in the discipline of social science data analysis, most people achieve this by using what are known as command files or syntax to write out the commands that the software processes on the data in order to generate the outputs. So it's possible that you've got used to using software like this, but without this command file structure. When you are dealing with larger, complicated secondary survey resources, it is much more preferable to be working in this manner with command files. Again, see our workshop on this topic for a little bit of expansion on this and some examples that you can have a look at if you're interested to. It is actually possible to take advantage of secondary survey resources without downloading and analysing the microdata in this way. It's well worth, if you haven't seen it before, it's well worth taking a look at Nesta, which is a tool for the online analysis of data, secondary survey data resources that are stored at the UK Data Archive. Again, there's some information on this within our training workshop. But Nesta is a system where you can identify the data set you're interested in and pick up a lot of information about records within it, including performing some limited online analysis of that data, producing tables and simple graphs based upon the analysis. There's lots of other things as well, and again we've got some links of them to these in our workshop materials. Nesta it can be used for analysing microdata stored at national archives such as the UK Data Archive. But for example, one of many other comparable resources here is the OECD Gender Data Portal, which gives you summary statistics about, well, in this case, gender inequalities over time and for different countries. In this example, we've got the youth unemployment rate by gender and its trends over time, and more detailed patterns in France. So there are ways you can get to rich, high quality social science information which don't involve downloading the survey and using software to analyse it. You can do it remotely in one way or another. And the other important point to say in introducing secondary survey data is that there's a lot of supplementary resources out there that can help you through the process if you're thinking of trying out some of these activities. There's all sorts of online resources such as statistics training resources, other courses and training materials that can be very helpful to you to find out about the process of downloading, analysing, getting high quality research results out of secondary survey data. It is true, I would argue anyway, that the more extended training courses are the more productive ones. So sometimes if you are thinking of going down this route, it's not necessarily enough to participate in a one-day introduction and that's the only thing you ever do. But it can be more effective to sign up to a more extended training activity, a residential course that runs over a few weeks, for example, such as the Essex Summer School, or to enrol on some MSc course or something where you look at this topic over a more sustained period of activity. These are obviously, it's not a possibility for everybody, but these more sustained training engagements are often more productive. One of the reasons actually that the more sustained training model is sometimes preferable is because of the statistical analysis component of secondary survey data analysis. So mostly we're talking about using somewhat more advanced statistical techniques of analysis, and we're also generally talking about another sort of data processing activity or statistical processing activity, which is slightly separate to data analysis but is related. We often refer in the discipline to data management as the organisation of data, such as processing metadata, dealing with missing data, linking together data from different data resources. All of these things are readily done with software resources, but there's some skills in knowing how to do that and learning about the different possibilities which come into the training and capacity building options. And again, I keep cross-referencing the ThinkData website and other things in our program, but we've got a number of materials on the web pages already or coming up on the web pages over coming weeks as we develop some materials that can give you some resources to help with these aspects of working with data files. Just as a minor point of interest, just finishing up on commenting on data resources, I think it's very interesting that the UK Data Archive, which is where major secondary survey data sets in the UK are stored and distributed, it's been around for a long time and they've been doing similar things for quite some time, of a very high quality, I would say, as well. This is an image from a website that describes the history of the archive actually, and it shows what they were doing in the mid-70s with data queries. They were responding to users and finding ways to get copies of data to users. They were also in the business of dealing with the acquisition of data, the organisation of data when it came in. And the point is that in secondary survey data analysis, the data providers, the people that archive the data and distribute it to others, have a very important role. In the UK, I would say we've been very lucky in that we've had high quality data providers working on the processing and distribution of secondary survey resources for a long time. And that means in the UK in particular, we now are in a situation where we're very wealthy, very well off for secondary survey data resources. Not everything about secondary survey data resources is of a high quality. There's quite some variations in the quality of data originally supplied to the archive and the quality with which it's curated and organised, often associated with the originator, the people that originally collected the data, rather than the people that archived it at something like the UK Data Archives. And we do see variations in quality of exploitation of survey data as well. Again, whilst secondary survey data resources are exciting, high quality resources, not everybody using them is exploiting them with high quality techniques of analysis. So there are questions and limitations in the area. But hopefully in this brief talk you get a sense of the scale and range and possibilities of secondary survey data resources. It's really quite exciting what is out there, and it makes a lot of sense to encourage more people to make more use of these sorts of resources, because not only are they very high quality empirical data, but they're easy to access and they're lower cost, a very efficient and effective way of finding out about societies. So certainly I would encourage you to think seriously about secondary survey data as a research resource. And again, coming back to our website, look to our website for other links and information on more materials about these resources.